The Tesladin is a fairly well-known and fairly well-worn build at this point, at least among Diablo 2 veterans. What is less known are the technical details about why this, and more recently the Dragondin build, works so well despite their self-cast versions being somewhat mediocre at best. And no, it is not solely because the need to use Conviction. What is also new to this equation is how much or how little the sundering effect influences the performance of this build in the latest 2.5 patch. That said, let's get the part most people do not understand out of the way, and that is why the Dragondin and Tesladin work the way they do with gear while underperforming at least a bit with the self-cast versions. The most obvious aspects, as mentioned, are how you can use Conviction alongside the gear aspect, and this does play a pretty big role, but there is a factor that is a lot more important. And that is basically that the attack auras behave slightly differently on equipment, even compared to other auras. And that is, while they still combine levels like other auras, they also stack their radial damage. So in the case of the Tesladin, using 2 pieces of Dream equipment results in your equipment-based Holy Shock being level 30. But also, since you're using 2 of them, you actually have 2 instances of this Holy Shock active as well. Now, why this matters is that while you still only gain a single punch of lightning damage to your attacks, like you would with skills like Enchant or Might, the damage auras themselves function differently than other auras on radial damage. So for each of these builds, you're actually doing radial damage for every piece of equipped gear. So 2 level 40 Holy Shock bursts of radial damage with the Tesladin, and 3 level 44 Holy Fire bursts for the Dragondin. And when you stack this with masteries, synergies, and scaling damage effects, you can get some pretty decent punch. Now you'd think that you'd want to tip your gear towards amplifying this, especially since Sunder Charms are now a thing alongside the short range amplification. And while this often works out fine, I find that keeping the classic balance of physical alongside these punchy elemental blasts to be generally better for your survival in the long term. And this is doubly true when you're doing the more budget and slightly less effective self-cast versions of these builds. And if you're trying Auradin builds as solo self-found, you will need to take that into consideration while working on progressing through the game, and unfortunately, this is one you really wouldn't want to avoid doing skill resets for, since the good damage boosting skills are higher level and there really aren't any good direct synergies or overlaps between them, at least other than Zeal. Though, if you want the real easy route, go through the game with the Fists of Hammerdin build we covered recently, and then respec into the Auradin after you get the gear. Otherwise, this will be a more challenging Zealot run. That said, if you do want to do it in normal difficulty for the Auradin, you'll want to go with the Holy Fire Paladin starter build. This involves getting Zeal for your attack, which you want to get just enough to reach 5 attacks with, provided you can get a relatively fast weapon, which should be your goal, with Steel or Malice being solid runewords for this option since they provide other useful bonuses. The skill layout for normal is actually super simple: Zeal, Holy Fire, and Resist Fire, with Holy Fire being the primary choice, Resist Fire being the secondary, and only investing enough in Zeal to get it to 5 swings. While other skills are handy along the way, like Charge, Holy Shield, and Salvation, don't bother getting more than 1 point in them if you go for them, and even then, they're not super important in normal difficulty. Now, moving into Nightmare, you should have all that finished off, and you have a choice as to which direction you want to go. If you stay the Fire Auradin, you'll still be able to get about halfway through Nightmare, though it won't be as easy as normal. And if you upgrade your weapon choices, you can actually get a bit further, maybe even to Hell if you're lucky. Items with Crushing Blow, like the Black Runeword, can be extremely helpful for this, or you can lean into a handful of other mid-tier runewords like Lawbringer, just as a handy mid-level weapon in general. Though, as said, by about the halfway point, you'll have likely gotten pointed to those handy sidekick skills like Holy Shield and Charge, and at this point you should be feeling the strain of, well, lack of damage, even with improved weapons in Nightmare. So upgrading to a new aura is going to be tempting, which leaves you with 3 choices basically. 1, stick with Holy Fire and struggle from mid-Nightmare through Hell unless you get a solid Zealot equipment and end up being a bit underpowered compared to the other options. 2, just respec into a proper Zealot with Fanaticism, make yourself a Lawbringer or similar budget weapon, and just rely on the physical damage. Or 3, switch over to Holy Shock through a respec with 20 into Holy Shock and Resist Lightning, and then spare points into getting your Zeal and Holy Shield up, at least up to speed. You'll be a good chunk of the way through Nightmare, and you'll end up using any spare points you have into Salvation to get that Holy Shock truly maxed out. All of these are going to struggle a little bit compared to plenty of other Paladin builds, with the Fanatic Zealot having the smoothest time of the 3, since at least the attack rating boost makes up a little bit for the lack of Conviction, while the other 2 will generally struggle with chance to hit, meaning you will need to invest in setups such as Angelic Amulet and Ring for attack rating bonuses, or even attack rating charms. And as you move into Hell, you'll really start to feel it, though you'll likely have reached a point where you could reasonably get the setup for a piece of equipment that helps the Holy Shock catch up to the Fanatic, and that is Crescent Moon. One of the better budget weapons for both the Holy Shock Auradin as well as the actual Tesladin itself, though as was said earlier, there are arguments for and against it on the actual endgame character. For the rest of your budget gear, it will be the standard fare stuff like a Spirit Shield, resist whenever you can cram them in, while at least maintaining your attack speed, though one trick, if you can't find a 3-socket phase blade and you have crap luck rolling sockets on them to get certain 3-socket weapons like Crescent Moons, find a low quality phase blade such as a cracked, crude, etc., and use the formula to remove the low quality tag from it, and you'll end up with an item level 1 phase blade, which Larzik will always socket to 3 sockets. Now, you may have noticed if you went through the game with these, they pretty much shine in Normal, are okay-ish in Nightmare, and they struggle a bit in Hell. This is because of the mechanics we mentioned earlier. But when stacked on with items to allow you to use that conviction, and allow you to use your spare skill points to boost more useful abilities, then and only then does the power ramp up from neat to actually pretty overpowered. That's because the chase gear makes these builds rather than the skill selection. For the Tesladin, this means eating up your shield and helmet slots with the Dream Runeward so you can double up on the Holy Shock damage, or going multiple slots on the Holy Fire gear like the Dragon Armor and Shield, which gives the Dragondin its name, but usually also slotting your weapon with Hand of Justice to push those numbers even higher and make it a triple stack of fire instead of a double stack. And in turn, you combine these with their synergies, which Resist Lightning and Salvation are for Tesladins, to maximize your lightning boost on the skill, or by getting Resist Fire and Salvation for the Dragondin to maximize your fire boosts on that skill, with both favoring fast weapons like Phase Blades and stacking it with Conviction to increase the damage dealt, not to mention improving your chance to hit with the physical attack, since while the double and triple stacked auras do solid damage in an area, the actual hits you do are going to be fairly important for your success as well. Beyond these slots, we pretty much go with standard melee character gear for the most part, with Gore Riders being generally the safest bet for melee character boots in general thanks to Open Wound and Crushing Blow, while in the rings we of course want to go with Raven Frost to keep from being chilled so our attack speed stays up, combine this with a Leech or attack rating ring or both if you can, or even just a resist ring, and you'll be doing fairly well, since unfortunately these auras don't really get much from plus skills, with any skill bumps we get pretty much just reducing how much we need to invest in Conviction, since it caps at 150% resist penetration and there's not much point going higher. The gloves are a bit more of a mixed selection, mostly depending on what flavor you go with, since I went with a physical leaning take on the Tesladin and was going to use it to farm all axe and even let it dip into Ubers. I went with the Dracghoul's Grasp, since the rest of our gear will give us enough attack speed, though if you're going Dragondin or you roll a slower Grief, you might want to dip into increased attack speed gloves like Laying of Hands. Though speaking of Grief, on the Dream Paladin I go with Grief for versatility and the fact that I still like relying on my main attack for consistent damage and Leech, and Grief provides this thanks to its damage boost, and it can augment Smite fairly well too in a pinch. If you're going to focus mostly on letting your aura do the work and don't mind sacrificing the physical damage you'd use for Leech, then Crescent Moon is more optimal for the aura tick damage on a Tesladin, with a 6 rainbow facet phase blade taking that play to the extreme, but you do lose far too much physical damage with that method for my personal taste. On the Dragondin, you'll pretty much just stick with Hand of Justice to maximize that fire damage in, well, both cases, since it not only boosts the fire damage you gain on your attacks, but also the radial damage it deals thanks to the minus resist. It's a nice middle ground between what Grief and Crescent Moon provide for the Tesla. In regards to the last 2 shared slots, the belt is generally either going to be something with damage reduction, like Verdungos or String of Ears, or in my case here, something to pinch off the lightning issue a little bit with Thunder Gods, which also has some other fun quirks you can play around with, though they're not super reliable. It is something to dump spare points into. On the amulet, it's a pretty easy pick to go High Lord's Wrath. It has Deadly Strike, Lightning Resist, a plus skill, and attack speed boost, which saves us needing to find it in other places, giving us the flexibility in glove and belt slots that we really want. As far as armor and helmet, these are partially taken up by the builds. In the case of the Dragondin, you have your helmet free, so you can go with a number of options, though with Flickering Flame being a thing, you'd be kind of hard pressed to beat it in the slot for the Holy Fire build, especially since you will be using a Fire Sundering Charm with it and need that extra resist, though you could go with some rainbow facet options here. For the Tesladin, you instead have your armor free, and yes, the most common choice will be Enigma or Chains of Honor, and I'm kind of tired of showing those off. just depending on your personal preference. But instead of showing those off, because like I said, I'm tired of it, I'm going to give some love to Principle, the Paladin armor rune word, mainly because it gives me an excuse to be a deviant and throw a little Holy Bolt synergy in on the skills through Fist of the Heavens, for my personal build to do a little extra, just magic damage per hit on demons and undeads. Though if you're not doing that, you just put the points into Holy Shield to save dexterity points when going for max block. Both are fine, I just wanted to have fun with it. It doesn't hurt that Principle has a massive life boost though, and thanks to being a flat amount, it actually gets ramped up a lot when using battle orders from Call to Arms. That said, there are ways to sort of hybridize these builds. For example, you can run Hand of Justice and Dragon Armor alongside Dream, Shield, and Helmet, and you'll have the points to invest both sets of synergies and Conviction, and do just fine. But it will be a lot more specific in how it performs, and you won't be leaning as hard into one Sundered element or the other, so for the split, I generally would not use Sunder Charms unless you really had that resist kind of setup squared away through charms and other gear. As far as which one is better of the 3 gear-based damage aura builds we've talked about here, that's actually a lot tougher of a call in 2.5 thanks to Sunder Charms, and it really ends up falling down to what you plan to farm in the long run, since you will generally be a bit less effective against natural immunes for either case, even with Sundered, compared to going against the non-immunes with a different element because of how, well, Conviction functions on Sundered enemies. But they all will perform quite well regardless. So, which Auradin do you prefer, and have you ever tried a self-cast version before? If so, how did it go? Mention it down below, and if you want to see an easier Paladin build to level with, check out the video on screen now, and stay tuned for a video covering these flavors of builds on an even more vicious character in the near future that is not a Paladin.